This is the jig that I normally assemble the diaphragms on. Here's the retainer plate. Now it's got 5 small indentations there. They go down on the jig. Those indentations are where the shutter blades sit, or the pivots for the shutter blades sit from memory. Right, so starting here, I've got my diaphragm blades all cleaned and ready to go. Now the diaphragm blades are not symmetrical. The pivot point, the rivet, is closer to the centre line of the blade at one end and closer to the outside edge of the blade at the other. And the rivet that's closest to the centre line of the blade is the one that I'm putting here, fitting here into the plate. These blades are fairly flat. I'm not expecting too many difficulties getting these into place. The first 6 or 7 blades are easy enough to get into place, as you'll see. The last few are not. You could say it gets progressively more tricky. At this stage, all the holes visible in the plate have been filled. I've got to pull back these other blades, pivot them on their other end so that I can get the remaining blades in place. Don't be surprised if you have to do this job multiple times before you are successful. That is entirely normal. It's an awkward job. Like all awkward jobs, it gets better with practice. That's the other thing you've got to watch out for, is accidentally catching the blades and lifting them out of place. Alright, one more blade to go. Didn't particularly like the feel of that last blade I moved. It may have moved out of its pivot. Let's get this blade in place anyway. Alright, now I've got to lift those blades up and lift them over the top of that last blade that's in there. And swing them in line back against the jig. That looks pretty good. I've got to achieve a couple of things here. First of all, the plate, which has 3 holes in it, has to go back in the correct position in the case. And the 10 pins that we see on the 10 diaphragm blades have to fall into the slots on the moving plate. Now, there's a complication here. This jig, as it's set, those blades are in the fully open position, effectively the F2 position. Now here, this mechanism is limited to only opening to f3.5, the maximum aperture of the lens in question. This tab at the end here blocks it from moving any further. Now in this case I've got two options. I can remove the screws from the scale so that the scale is no longer blocking me, whereas I've discovered in this case I can simply lift that pointer over the scale and swing it right round to the fully open or F2 position. Of course that's what I'm going to do because I don't like taking things off or indulging in any hard work I don't need to indulge in. So where's the case going? Well, we've got our three fixing screws. I've got two facing me here and one up the top there. And they correspond to this hole, and that hole. Now if I line the slots up here with this hole, that's going to line up with this pin here. So if I can get them all correctly aligned, I should be in business, in theory. So flipping this up so I can take a excuse me, a line of sight with that slot so I know where I'm putting it down, which one I'm putting down over that pivot. That one, I would drop that down over those pivots, give it a wriggle to seat them all. Hopefully they're all seated correctly. If I flip my jig over, lift the outside piece off the top, put it through underneath to support things, and with luck everything went smoothly. I can see the whole screw holes here, so I'll put a screw in the screw holes there, that retainer plate. Let's get one screw started. I'm not doing these screws up tight, I just want them in place and contacting that plate. And that's because if one of the blades has become displaced, I don't want to damage the blade by trapping it where it shouldn't be. Rotate that, and there's the third screw. Yeah, is that how they all connected? Yeah, it looks like they are. Looks like that all happened nicely. So I'll lift this pointer back over that end of that scale, and the blades are all nice and clean and they move smoothly inside their normal range. I can tighten those three screws up now. And check again to make sure it still moves freely. That's good. Nice smooth action. No oil on the blades. That's just like I bought one. So that's our shutter case with the diaphragm all assembled and ready to go. I can turn my attention to this mechanism plate. And this, as I've said earlier, I've got to swab that down with some Naphtha on a cotton bud and remove all traces of this old grease. There's old yellow grease all over this and it's all got to come off. You have to be careful not to catch on the spring and damage the spring, but that spring is awkward to put in place, so it would be a fight to take it off. It would be worse to try and get it back again. So leave it in place and just be careful and work around it as the order of the day. And round the lens tube, that's the centre section here, I'm making sure I've got all the old grease off from around there. That brings us to the retard gear train. Now there's a couple of things to note here. One is that there's a hairspring here and that's easily damaged. What I do is I hold the pallet's arm out, swing this arm all the way across, release the pallet arm. That's wound up that gear mechanism. That hairspring's wound up out of the way, out of harm's way. Now I can take a cotton bud with some naphtha on it and run it round that surface of the lens tube on the inside of the retard gear train, and I'll do that again. As I come round with this, of course, I hit the lever and that releases the mechanism and the retard gear train runs down. I'm expecting someone to come and collect their camera today. I thought that was them at the door, but it wasn't. Okay, so that's quite good on that side. I want to clean this side of the mechanism plate. I can see a fair bit of old grease and rubbish here too. You can see how much comes off there. This groove around the inside here is where the blade actuating ring will run. So you need to make sure that's nice and clean. And I'm going to run around the outside edge of this shutter body. That's quite good. I want to deal with this retard gear train now. I'm going to do that by pouring in a bit of naphtha, holding back the pallets and working that arm repeatedly, and rinse and repeat basically. And what that'll do is that'll flush away any dust, dirt, and in our case old oil and grease we're concerned about. And I'll blow that out with a blower. It's important to blow away the solvent because then it's carrying away all the impurities with it. If you simply leave it in place to evaporate and dry, it'll leave all the impurities behind. They won't go anywhere. We want them out. So that's the way to do it. Flood it and blow away the solvent. Well, that looks good. I'm quite happy with the state of that. Of course, I've got to deal with the blade actuating ring and the retainer plate. Well, if you look at the colour of that retainer plate, that's quite oily. So all of that stuff needs to be cleaned. It's just the same process. A bit of naphtha. You can see the colour of the stuff coming off there. That's grease and verdigris, and that's from the brass there. The brass is showing through. This face faces the shutter blades. That needs to be especially clean. Handle this thing by the edges so that you don't leave your fingerprints behind for the next person to find. Your fingerprints will etch into skin oils and perspiration. They'll just etch those fingerprints straight into the metal. They'll be there forever. This has got its share of marks on there already, but they're not severe, they'll be alright. And the blade actuating ring itself should be nice and clean and shiny. Of course this is somewhat dull and dirty. Now there are different options for lubricating the blade actuating ring. Some people prefer to put a smear of graphite grease or similar on there. Sometimes I use a smear of molybdenum paste. Commonly I use graphite powder once I have everything assembled. An alternative is if you've got a very soft lead pencil, you can rub over all the surfaces with a soft lead pencil, which will leave a layer of graphite behind, and that is a very good lubricant. But whatever you do, don't use oil. Okay, so that looks good. I should have 3 screws that hold all that together. So here they are. I'll just clean those, since there's no point cleaning everything and then putting dirty, greasy screws in there. Be careful when you're doing this, those screws want to pick up on the edge of your cleaning tool and zip off over the edge of the table where you'll never find them again. That seems fine. Here we go. There's a pin on here that couples to our lever from the top of the shutter. That pin drops into that little fork there. This plate has a single rivet on that surface. That drops into a notch in the plate here, and that locates that quite firmly. We have our 3 screws. Well, I know from experience that a short one goes here, a short one goes here, and a long screw goes over here. There were no surprises there for me, so I didn't have to mark anything. If you're not sure where the short screws go, you can always mark it as you take it apart. And typically what people do is if there are 2 short screws and a long screw, they might put a little tick mark, scratch a little tick mark into the plate up here. Just remind them that that's where the long screw goes. Do those 3 screws up. Check that that moves freely. That's good. It's all moving nicely. So our mechanism plate looks nice and clean now. It's as it should look. The lever that goes on the top and operates this is here with its retaining screw, and that is pretty grimy. I can't immediately tell whether that's a layer of dirt and grease on there, or whether it's discoloration just from oxidation of the metal. Probably a bit of both. But I'm cleaning them to make sure that there's no contaminants there. Nothing I want to see the back of. Alright, just pop those aside for the moment. Bring back our mechanism plate. Here's where that lever fits. And I'm going to take some molybdenum paste. Wipe once through the pivot hole, and in the slot at the end where it engages that pin on the blade actuating ring, I'll put a wipe through there too. I may have been somewhat generous with that paste, but I don't think it'll do any harm today. The screw, my tweezers are a bit sticky. Get that screw in place. Check the action of that arm, that seems good. Now hook its return spring into place. It's very snappy in its action, that all feels good. So I want to lubricate this before I go much further. There are two things I want to lubricate. I want to lubricate in around the blade actuating ring, and I'm going to do that with graphite powder. And I want to lubricate the retard gear train itself, again with graphite powder. So that's the next thing to do. Here I've got some graphite powder just loose in this container because that's where I typically do this job. I'm dropping it in around the blade actuating ring there. And I'll work the blade actuating ring. To settle that down between the blade actuating ring and the mechanism plate, and that'll do quite nicely. And the retard gear train here, I'm going to deal with that in much the same way. I'll drop some graphite powder into the gear set, hold back the pallets and work the action repeatedly. And what that does is it lubricates the little gears, probably the face of the teeth of the gears, the wheels, so everything rolls smoothly. Now I'll go and blow all that excess powder away, and that's all done. The action's nice and snappy, everything moves well. Just remove my fingerprints from the top of this retard gear train. Those marks are permanent, they've obviously been there a long time. Just making sure these surfaces are all clean. And that's just about ready to have the shutter blades put back, so I'll put that to one side. Got to deal with these shutter blades. As you can see, they are well and truly stuck together with oil. So I'll need to swab these down with some naphtha and have a look at them to see if they need any more treatment than that. They probably don't. If they're heavily marked or if they show any sign of surface corrosion, I would have to polish those blades with a bit of metal polish. Typically I use brass, so I'll clean these anyway. I have my shutter blades all clean. I've disconnected the spring from this arm and I'm pushing that arm to the out position, which is where the shutter blades will be fully open. Now the first shutter blade to put in place has an extra hole in it to identify it. The extra hole serves no other purpose as far as I can tell. And that first blade goes here. The second blade goes here. Third blade. Apart from that extra hole, the blades are otherwise identical. You could have them in any order you like, really. Here we go. That's all the blades in place, and now I can put the case over the top. Well, the screw holes here are not symmetrical. These two are obviously closer together. So it's just a case of finding out where holes in the case are that align with those ones, if I lower this into position, there are 3 case screws that go in place. Get them started. As with the diaphragm earlier, don't tighten up the screws until you're sure that everything is correctly seated. You don't want to end up with a shutter blade getting damaged because it had moved while you were putting the case over the top and got trapped between part of the mechanism it wasn't intended to be at. Make sure that's alright. Let's flip that over. Swing the arm in. Those blades came in no problem, were nice and smooth. I'm going to lift that spring over and connect that back up. That looks good. I can tighten those 3 screws now. And you can see that action is quite positive now. Snappy, exactly as it should be, and nothing like it was to start off with. So now I've just got to clean all the other components up and put them back on the mechanism plate.